In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, where the land folds itself into a shallow canyon cut by a wash that carries water only a handful of days each year, there is a wall of shaped sandstone standing taller than a two-story house, laid stone by stone in a pattern so precise that modern masons who have tried to replicate it by hand still find themselves humbled by the effort. This wall belongs to a building called Pueblo Bonito, and Pueblo Bonito is only the largest of more than a dozen so-called great houses scattered across a 9-mile stretch of canyon that, for reasons still argued over by archaeologists today, became for a few centuries the undisputed center of an entire cultural world across the American Southwest. A world that at its height reached its influence outward across tens of thousands of square miles of desert, mountain, and mesa, with almost none of the tools you would assume such an achievement required. No draft animals. No wheeled carts. No metal tools. No system of writing that anyone has ever found. And yet here, in a canyon with an unreliable water supply and a growing season shorter than almost anywhere else in the region, people raised multi-story stone buildings with hundreds of interconnected rooms, engineered arrow-straight roads running for scores of miles across some of the harshest terrain in North America, and tracked the movements of the sun and moon with an accuracy that still checks out against modern astronomical calculations. Tonight's story is about Chaco Canyon, and about the people who built it, occupied it, and eventually walked away from it, not vanishing, not disappearing into myth the way old adventure books like to claim about ancient ruins, but moving on, carrying what they had learned there into new homes their descendants still occupy across the Southwest today. The real mystery of Chaco was never what happened to the people. The real mystery is what this place actually was, and why, after centuries of ever more ambitious building, they eventually let it go quiet. Chaco Canyon sits within what is now the Navajo Nation and San Juan Basin of New Mexico, a stretch of high desert averaging around 6,000 feet in elevation, hemmed in by low sandstone cliffs and open to a sky that, on a clear night, away from any artificial light, shows more stars than most people living today have ever seen at once. Archaeologists generally date the rise of Chaco's monumental building to somewhere around 850 CE, with the canyon's greatest and most intensive period of construction and influence running from roughly 1030 to 1130, a span of about 100 years during which the scale of what was being built there increased dramatically, before a long, complicated decline set in over the following century. During that peak period, the people archaeologists call the Ancestral Puebloans, direct cultural ancestors of the modern Pueblo, Hopi, and Zuni nations who still live across this same region today, raised at least a dozen so-called great houses within the canyon itself, plus dozens more scattered outposts across the wider San Juan Basin, some of them more than 50 miles from the canyon center, all built following recognizably similar architectural conventions, oriented, decorated, and engineered as though they belonged to a single coordinated tradition rather than the scattered, independent work of isolated farming communities. Pueblo Bonito remains the largest and most thoroughly studied of these great houses, and it is worth sitting with the scale of it for a moment. Built up in stages over roughly 3 centuries, it eventually reached somewhere between 600 and 800 rooms, arranged in a graceful D-shape against the base of the canyon's northern cliff, its straight back wall running nearly the length of 2 football fields, its rounded front curving outward to enclose a series of open plazas dotted with more than 30 circular ceremonial chambers called kivas, some small and domestic in scale, others enormous, sunk deep into the earth and roofed with heavy timber, clearly built for gatherings far larger than any single household could produce. In places the building rose 4, possibly 5 stories high, terraced back like a stepped pyramid so that rooftops became working space and walkways for the levels above, an engineering feat that required builders to calculate load-bearing capacity across an enormous rubble and mortar structure using nothing but accumulated experience and an evidently very precise intuitive feel for stone. The masonry itself, especially in the later building phases, is what still draws specialists back again and again, a technique called core-and-veneer construction, in which a rough rubble and mud core provided the structural bulk of the wall while a carefully fitted outer veneer of thin, evenly shaped sandstone tablets, sometimes alternating bands of larger and smaller stones in a deliberate decorative rhythm, was laid over the surface with a precision that had no clear practical necessity at all. The core alone would have held the building up. The veneer is aesthetic, patterned, intentional, evidence of builders who cared not just that a wall stood, but that it looked a very particular way once finished, a level of applied craft normally associated with monumental architecture built to display power, wealth, or religious authority rather than ordinary domestic construction. That sense of deliberate design runs through the whole complex, and nowhere more strikingly than in its relationship with the sky. Pueblo Bonito's straight-back wall runs almost precisely along a true north-south axis, accurate enough that early surveyors initially assumed later, more sophisticated instruments must have been used to correct earlier, cruder measurements, only to eventually accept that the alignment really was this exact from the very first building phase. Doorways, windows, and internal corner alignments throughout several of the canyon's great houses appear to track the rising and setting points of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, channeling shafts of light onto specific interior walls or through specific internal openings on those particular mornings of the year and no others, a pattern too consistent across too many separate buildings to easily dismiss as coincidence, though archaeologists continue to argue over exactly how many of the proposed alignments were genuinely intentional design choices versus the kind of pattern the human eye is always eager to find once it goes looking. The single most famous piece of evidence for this astronomical sophistication sits atop Fajada Butte, a solitary sandstone formation rising near the canyon's mouth, where in 1977 an artist and researcher named Anna Sofar noticed three large sandstone slabs leaning together against a cliff face, positioned in such a way that on the summer solstice, a narrow dagger of sunlight slices directly through the gap between them and falls across the center of a spiral petroglyph carved into the rock behind. On the winter solstice, two separate daggers of light frame the same spiral on either side. On the equinoxes, a smaller shaft of light bisects a second, smaller spiral nearby. Whether this arrangement of slabs was deliberately engineered by Chacoan builders or represents a natural rock fall that ancient observers noticed was already doing something remarkable and then marked with the spiral carving, is still debated, and the site itself has shifted slightly since its 1977 discovery, subtly altering the light pattern that first drew attention to it and complicating any future attempt to test the original alignment with full confidence. But taken together with the solar and lunar alignments built directly into the architecture of the great houses themselves, the Sun Dagger fits a much larger pattern. Whoever organized the building of Chaco Canyon was watching the sky closely, over multiple human generations, and building that knowledge permanently into stone. If the quiet of that canyon, its long shadows crossing sandstone walls built to track a sun that still rises exactly where its architects expected it to 900 years later, is starting to settle you in for the night, this is a good point to pause and hit subscribe, because the story is about to turn toward the questions that still genuinely divide the archaeologists who have spent their careers here: what Chaco actually was, who actually lived inside these enormous buildings, and where all that stone, timber, and imported wealth was really coming from. Here is the detail that appends almost every intuitive assumption a visitor standing inside Pueblo Bonito today is likely to form. A building with 600 to 800 rooms looks, on its face, like it should have housed a substantial population, plausibly thousands of people living, cooking, sleeping, and raising families across generations inside a single sprawling apartment complex. But when archaeologists have carefully excavated hearths, trash middens, burial numbers, and the kind of everyday domestic debris that accumulates wherever people actually live day to day, year after year, the numbers that come back are startlingly small. Some researchers estimate that Pueblo Bonito, at its most heavily occupied, may have housed only a few dozen to perhaps 100 or so permanent residents at any given time, a population that could have comfortably occupied a small fraction of the building's total room count, leaving the overwhelming majority of those hundreds of rooms looking, in the archaeological record, less like lived-in homes and more like storage space, ceremonial space, or rooms that were built, used sparingly, and then deliberately sealed and left largely empty. This mismatch between architectural scale and residential evidence sits at the very center of the ongoing scholarly argument about what Chaco actually was. One school of thought treats the great houses primarily as a kind of pilgrimage and ceremonial infrastructure, monumental architecture built to host large gatherings, seasonal ceremonies, trade fairs, and religious observances tied to the solar calendar, drawing in populations from across the wider San Juan Basin who traveled to the canyon for specific events and then largely returned home again, leaving Chaco itself populated only by a comparatively small resident caretaker class the rest of the year. Under this reading, the empty rooms were never meant to house permanent families at all, they were storage for ceremonial goods, offerings, and provisions needed to host the crowds that periodically filled the canyon's plazas, and the extraordinary architectural investment reflects religious and communal ambition rather than the practical housing needs of a dense urban population. A competing view argues that Chaco, whatever ceremonial functions it clearly also served, was nonetheless a genuine administrative and political center, home to an elite class who directed a network of allied and dependent communities scattered across the San Juan Basin, with the empty rooms functioning as controlled storage for the tribute, surplus grain, and trade goods flowing into the canyon from outlying settlements, the physical infrastructure of a redistributive economy managed from the top down by a resident ruling group whose numbers were small precisely because political and religious authority was concentrated rather than broadly shared. Excavation across the wider canyon complicates both positions in useful ways. Smaller residential sites scattered around and between the great houses, sometimes called unit pueblos, do show the kind of dense, ordinary domestic occupation debris that Pueblo Bonito itself largely lacks, suggesting that most of the canyon's actual day-to-day population, whatever it numbered at its peak, may have lived in these smaller structures surrounding the monumental great houses, while the great houses themselves served a more specialized, less continuously domestic function, whether administrative, ceremonial, or, as most current researchers now suspect, some genuinely layered combination of both roles operating simultaneously and shifting in emphasis across the canyon's long occupation. What almost no serious researcher argues any longer is the older, simpler assumption that Pueblo Bonito's hundreds of rooms represent a straightforward measure of how many people lived there full-time, a reminder of how easily monumental scale can mislead modern intuition about ancient population, and a genuinely open question that continues to shape excavation priorities at the site to this day. Whatever the resident population actually was, the canyon's reach across the surrounding landscape was extraordinary, and nowhere is that reach more visible, or more genuinely strange, than in Chaco's road system. Beginning in the 1970s, archaeologists using aerial photography started identifying a network of engineered roadways radiating outward from the canyon, cut and cleared with real deliberate labor rather than worn gradually by the accumulated foot traffic of ordinary travel, running for a combined distance that current estimates place somewhere around 200 miles of clearly documented roadway, with some researchers arguing the original network, much of it since eroded away or obscured by later land use, may have extended considerably further still. What makes these roads so puzzling isn't simply their length, but their engineering. Chacoan roads run, in long stretches, in perfectly straight lines across open desert, deviating for nothing, cutting directly through low ridges rather than curving gently around them, carved as formal staircases directly into sheer cliff faces where the straight line demanded it rather than diverting to an easier natural route nearby, and built unusually wide for a society that possessed no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals to justify that width, in many stretches running 30 feet across, several times wider than the foot traffic they apparently carried would have required on purely practical grounds. Some of these roads connect Chaco Canyon to genuine outlying great houses, most notably a well-documented road running roughly 45 miles north to a substantial Chacoan-style community near modern Aztec, New Mexico, which itself would eventually inherit much of Chaco's ceremonial importance after the canyon's own decline. But a striking number of the roads simply don't lead anywhere archaeologists have been able to identify as an obvious destination at all, running for miles across open desert before petering out at no particular settlement, water source, or resource site, a pattern that has led some researchers to argue the roads served symbolic or ceremonial functions, deliberately aligned with cardinal directions or with the positions of other great houses, as much as they served any practical transportation purpose, physical expressions of cosmological order laid directly onto the landscape rather than simple infrastructure built to move goods and people efficiently from one place to another. That question of symbolic geography feeds directly into one of the more genuinely contested ideas in Chacoan archaeology, an argument put forward most forcefully by the archaeologist Stephen Lexon and known informally as the Chaco Meridian. Lexon noticed that Chaco Canyon, the later great house complex at Aztec that inherited much of Chaco's ceremonial authority after roughly 1100, and a much later and more distant monumental center at Puquim, also called Casas Grandes, in what is now northern Mexico, occupied sites falling suspiciously close to the same north-south line of longitude, and he proposed that this alignment reflected a deliberate, remembered tradition of dynastic relocation, a ruling lineage or its symbolic authority moving south along a consciously maintained meridian across multiple centuries as each successive center rose and eventually declined in turn. The idea is genuinely provocative, and it has never achieved anything close to consensus among southwestern archaeologists, many of whom argue the alignment is closer to coincidence than deliberate design, or point out that precisely replicating a true meridian line across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain using only naked-eye astronomy would have been an extraordinary feat even for a society this sophisticated at tracking the sky. But the debate itself is a useful window into just how much genuine uncertainty still surrounds the most basic questions about how the Chacoan world understood its own geography, its own political relationships across the wider landscape, and its own sense of connection to the great houses that came both before and after Chaco Canyon's own peak. Nothing makes the reach of Chaco's world more vivid, though, than the physical evidence of what was actually moving in and out of that canyon across those roads and trails, because for a community sitting in an isolated high desert basin with limited local resources, Chaco's material wealth is genuinely startling. Turquoise recovered from Chaco Canyon sites runs into the tens of thousands of individual pieces, beads, pendants, inlay fragments, and raw nodules, some sourced from the Cerrillos Hills mining district near modern Santa Fe, more than 100 miles to the east, worked and distributed through the canyon in quantities suggesting Chaco functioned as a genuine regional hub for turquoise processing and redistribution across the wider Southwest, a position of economic centrality entirely separate from, and additional to, whatever religious or political authority the canyon also held. Copper bells recovered from Chacoan sites originated from metalworking traditions in western Mexico, arriving via trade networks stretching well over 1,000 miles to the south. Scarlet macaws, a species native only to the tropical lowlands of Mexico and Central America, have been recovered from Pueblo Bonito burial and ceremonial contexts in numbers substantial enough to indicate a sustained, organized trade in living birds carried alive across enormous distances of harsh, arid terrain, evidently prized enough for their brilliant plumage and ceremonial significance to justify that difficulty. And in 2009, researchers analyzing residue inside cylindrical ceramic jars recovered from Pueblo Bonito identified clear chemical traces of theobromine, the signature compound found in cacao, meaning someone in this high desert canyon, more than 1,000 miles from where cacao trees actually grow in Mesoamerica, was drinking a prepared cacao beverage, quite possibly a version of the same frothed, ritually significant chocolate drink associated with elite and ceremonial life among Mesoamerican civilizations far to the south. Physical proof of a trade and cultural exchange network connecting this isolated New Mexican canyon to the tropical world of Mexico across a distance that, on foot, without draft animals, would have taken traders many weeks or months to cross in either direction. Timber tells an equally striking story, though in the opposite direction, about labor rather than exotic trade. Tree-ring analysis of construction beams recovered from Chaco's great houses indicates that builders used well over 200,000 large logs across the canyon's full construction history, primarily ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, species that do not grow anywhere near Chaco Canyon itself, whose immediate surroundings offer only scattered pinyon and juniper woodland entirely unsuited to serious structural construction. The nearest substantial stands of suitable timber grow in mountain ranges, chiefly the Chusca Mountains to the west and the San Mateo and Zuni mountain ranges to the south, sitting anywhere from 50 to more than 75 miles from the canyon as measured in a straight line, considerably further by any practical overland route across intervening mesas and canyons. Every one of those logs, understood to be selected, felled, trimmed, and then carried the entire distance to Chaco Canyon on human shoulders, since this was a society with no draft animals and no wheeled transport of any kind, represents a staggering, sustained investment of coordinated labor stretched out across generations of continuous construction, an organizational achievement that, whatever else remains uncertain about Chacoan society, makes clear that whoever directed this building program commanded the loyalty, obligation, or genuine religious conviction of a very large workforce drawn from well beyond the canyon's own small resident population, people willing to walk for days, again and again, carrying heavy timber on their backs across difficult desert terrain, in service of a building project whose full purpose they may have understood far better than we do today. All of that coordinated labor, all of that long-distance wealth, and all of that precise astronomical engineering sit at the heart of the deepest and most genuinely unresolved question in Chacoan archaeology, which is simply what kind of society actually organized it. Some researchers, following Lexon's broader arguments, favor a relatively centralized, even quasi-monarchical model, a small ruling elite, quite possibly a single powerful lineage, directing labor, trade, and religious authority across the wider Chacoan world from a genuine seat of political power inside the canyon itself. Others argue forcefully against any such hierarchical reading, pointing to the near-total absence of anything resembling elite residential palaces distinct from ceremonial space, the lack of a clear top-down administrative infrastructure of the kind found in unambiguous early states elsewhere in the ancient world, and the relatively modest nature of the burials that have been excavated at Chaco, which, while including some genuinely wealth-laden individual graves inside Pueblo Bonito itself, notably 2 burial chambers containing individuals interred with extraordinary quantities of turquoise, shell, and other valuable goods, still fall well short of the kind of unmistakably royal tomb architecture that marks clearly stratified early states in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or elsewhere. This second group tends to favor a more distributed, consensus-driven model, in which Chaco functioned less as the capital of a state and more as a shared ceremonial and pilgrimage center whose enormous building projects were organized through ritual obligation, seasonal gathering, and voluntary communal labor, drawing on a broad, loosely federated network of Puebloan communities across the San Juan Basin, rather than through the coercive command of a small hereditary elite. The genuinely honest position, and the one most current specialists now favor in some form, is that Chaco does not map cleanly onto either familiar model, that it represented something structurally distinctive, a form of religious, economic, and political authority that doesn't have a tidy equivalent anywhere else in the archaeological record, which is part of what makes reconstructing its true nature from material remains alone so persistently difficult. Set against this backdrop of genuine, careful scholarly uncertainty sits one of the more disturbing and far more contested chapters in the archaeology of the wider Chacoan world, and it deserves to be discussed honestly, with all its disputed evidence and disputed conclusions left visible rather than smoothed over. In the early 1990s, excavation at a site called Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado, associated with the broader ancestral Puebloan cultural world of this same general era though not inside Chaco Canyon itself, uncovered the disarticulated, processed remains of several individuals in a residential pit structure. Bones that researchers Tim White and later Christy and Jacqueline Turner argued showed a pattern of cut marks, breakage, and burning consistent with the systematic butchering and cooking of human bodies, and a residue sample taken from a cooking pot at the site was reported to test positive for human myoglobin, a muscle protein whose presence would indicate human flesh had been cooked in that specific vessel. This evidence, and comparable disputed findings from a handful of other sites across the wider ancestral Puebloan world from roughly this same period, sparked one of the most heated debates in the field's recent history, with some researchers accepting the case for episodic cannibalism, whether from starvation, warfare, or ritualized violence against outsiders or social deviance, as the most straightforward reading of the physical evidence, while other archaeologists, including several who work extensively with descendant Puebloan communities, have pushed back hard, questioning the reliability of the myoglobin testing methodology used at the time, proposing that the bone processing patterns could instead reflect extreme violence, warfare, or the deliberate ritual desecration of enemies' remains without necessarily involving consumption at all, and raising legitimate concern about how readily sensational claims of cannibalism have historically been applied to indigenous peoples across the Americas with a lower evidentiary bar than similar claims would receive when applied elsewhere in the world. This remains, deliberately, an open and disputed question within the field rather than a settled fact, and it should be understood that way, one genuinely unresolved and uncomfortable thread within the much larger, and mostly far less violent, story of what daily and ceremonial life across the Chacoan world actually looked like. However Chacoan society was actually organized, and whatever combination of ceremony, coercion, and communal devotion held it together, the archaeological record makes one thing unambiguous: sometime across the middle of the 12th century, the canyon's centuries-long trajectory of ever more ambitious building came to a stop, and the population that had sustained it began, gradually rather than suddenly, to leave. Tree-ring records recovered from construction beams and preserved wood across the region give archaeologists an unusually precise climate record for this exact period, and that record shows a severe, sustained drought settling over the San Juan Basin beginning around 1130 and continuing, with only partial relief, for roughly 50 years. A climatic disaster striking a landscape that was already operating at the outer edge of what its agriculture could reliably support even in good years. Construction of major new great houses within the canyon effectively ceased during this window. Existing structures show evidence of reduced maintenance and, in some cases, deliberate closure of certain rooms and kivas. Treating dated construction timber, that same resource whose transport had represented such an extraordinary earlier investment of communal labor, drops off sharply in the later archaeological record, both because a prolonged drought would have made large-scale logging expeditions far harder to sustain and because the underlying social and religious motivation to keep expanding the canyon's monumental architecture appears, for reasons that remain only partly understood, to have weakened considerably during this same period regardless of climate alone. What happened next was not disappearance. It was migration, in stages, over generations, following patterns that show up clearly enough in the archaeological record even without a written account to confirm the details. Chaco's ceremonial and political center of gravity shifted first toward great houses further north, particularly the substantial Chacoan-style complex near modern Aztec, New Mexico, already connected to the canyon by one of its most clearly documented formal roads, and other communities across the northern San Juan region, especially the Mesa Verde area of southwestern Colorado, which entered its own period of intensive construction, including the famous cliff dwellings, in the century or so. Following Chaco's decline, apparently absorbing at least some portion of the displaced Chacoan population along with elements of its architectural and religious tradition. That Mesa Verde florescence itself proved relatively short-lived, and by the close of the 13th century, facing its own combination of drought, resource pressure, and social strain, the northern San Juan region was itself substantially depopulated, its communities moving on again, this time further south and east, into the Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico, and further west onto the mesas that the Hopi villages occupy today, and toward the Pueblo of Zuni and its surrounding communities. These were not new, unrelated peoples arriving to replace something lost. They were, according to both the archaeological record and the oral traditions maintained by these communities themselves, the direct cultural and genetic descendants of the people who built Pueblo Bonito, carrying with them, across each stage of this extended migration, architectural knowledge, ceremonial practice, clan structures, and origin narratives that many Puebloan communities today still explicitly connect back to Chaco Canyon and to the broader ancestral Puebloan world at once. Anchored, treating the canyon not as a dead ruin belonging to a vanished people, but as an ancestral place, sacred and remembered, within a living, continuous cultural history that never actually broke. That distinction matters, and it's worth being direct about it before this story reaches its end. Chaco Canyon has too often been written about, especially in older popular accounts, using exactly the kind of breathless, mysterious vanished race language that gets applied lazily to indigenous sites across the Americas, as though the builders of Pueblo Bonito simply evaporated, leaving their stone walls as a puzzle for someone else entirely to eventually solve. That framing isn't just imprecise, it's factually wrong. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo nations of the Rio Grande Valley, the Hopi villages of northeastern Arizona, and the people of Zuni, all of whom maintain their own oral histories, their own understanding of the migrations that carried their ancestors away from Chaco and Mesa Verde and eventually into the communities they occupy today, and their own ongoing relationship, cultural, spiritual, and in the case of formal consultation on excavation and site management, actively institutional. With Chaco Canyon as an ancestral homeland rather than a lost civilization's abandoned ruin. The real mystery was never where the people went. It's a narrower, more specific question: why this particular place, after centuries of investment so extraordinary that its builders hauled timber 50 miles on their own shoulders and tracked the solstice sun to within a matter of minutes using nothing but carefully placed stone, stopped being the center of that world, and why, once the long drought eventually broke, the canyon's people chose not to return to it in anything like their earlier numbers, even though later generations clearly still remembered it, still returned occasionally for ceremony, and still, in some communities, remember it now. So here, at the end of this story, is what the evidence actually supports, and what it honestly doesn't. We know Chaco Canyon became, for roughly 2 centuries, the ceremonial, and very likely also the political and economic, center of an extraordinarily wide-reaching cultural network across the American Southwest, a canyon of modest natural resources that nonetheless commanded turquoise from 100 miles east, timber from 50 miles west, scarlet macaws and cacao from well over 1,000 miles south, and enough organized human labor to raise multi-story masonry buildings whose walls still stand true to the cardinal directions 9 centuries later. We know its builders tracked the sun and moon with a precision that continues to check out against modern astronomical calculation, and that they built roads across the desert wider and straighter than the traffic those roads apparently carried, for reasons that may have been more cosmological than practical. We know a devastating, decades-long drought settled over the region right around the time the canyon's long building program stopped, and that the population shifted outward afterward, first to Mesa Verde, then further still, into the ancestral roots of the Rio Grande Pueblos, the Hopi Mesas, and Zuni. What we don't know, and what the current archaeological evidence genuinely cannot yet settle, is whether Chaco was ultimately the seat of something like a state, a vast shared ceremonial pilgrimage site, or some form of social organization with no clean modern equivalent at all, whether the empty rooms inside Pueblo Bonito reflect storage, ritual restriction, or simply architectural ambition that outran the population it was ever meant to house, and precisely what combination of drought, social strain, religious change, and perhaps internal conflict finally convinced a canyon's worth of people, after so many generations of hauling stone and timber toward this single extraordinary place, to let its great houses stand empty and walk on toward the mesas, valleys, and rivers where their descendants still live today. We don't know the full answer. But the walls are still standing, oriented to a sun that still rises exactly where they expected it to, and somewhere among the Pueblo, Hopi, and Zuni communities who trace their own histories back through these same canyons, the story, in some form, is still being told.